Stop. The Arcturian Sentinels have already moved past the threshold on your behalf, and the seal that was set tonight cannot be undone. This transmission comes directly from the Arcturian Signal Council. What is being disclosed here is not a preparation for something that might happen. It is a confirmation of something that has already been executed. The Sentinels sealed your field tonight, and the vector that was pulling you back into the prior compromised configuration has been permanently closed. No Sentinel intervention can reopen it. That window is gone. What remains now is the understanding of why this was authorized, what was sealed out, and what your body needed to hold during the sealing window, so the lock set without distortion. By the end of this transmission, you will understand exactly what compromise patterns were identified and sealed, what frequency hijack vectors had been pressing against your perimeter, and what the Arcturians already know about why this seal was authorized tonight rather than at any earlier point. But here is the first revelation. What you have been calling exhaustion, instability, or that strange sense that something keeps pulling you backward is not personal failure. It is the identifiable signature of a compromised field configuration that the Arcturian Sentinels recognized as having crossed a critical threshold, one that authorized the seal. The algorithm did not create this moment. It only delivered it. Your field brought you here because the sealing has already happened, and the recognition must follow. You are guided here because the warning is already active. What has already happened in your field tonight is not something you initiated. You did not choose the timing. You did not call for the seal through ritual, through discipline, or through any act of deliberate preparation. The Arcturian Sentinels do not wait for readiness in the way a human mind understands readiness. They move when the field reaches a threshold that can no longer hold without intervention. And what they recognized in your configuration tonight was not potential compromise. It was active compromise. A vector that had been feeding off your perimeter for long enough that the pattern had begun to shape how you read your own life. Not just how you felt, how you interpreted, how you assigned meaning, how you decided what was real and what was worth naming. That is what crossed the line. That is what authorized the seal. You need to understand what that means before you move forward. Because the seal itself is complete, but the recognition is not. And an unsealed mind carrying a sealed field is still a vulnerable system. Think of it this way. If a structural fracture in a building is repaired, but the occupants never understand what caused it, the same conditions that produced the first fracture will reproduce themselves until the building cracks again, somewhere deeper. The Sentinels closed the vector. They did not remove your blind spots about it. That is why this transmission exists. Not to repeat what happened, but to give you the precise interpretive map your system needs to understand what was pressing against it, why it kept succeeding in small ways, and what it was targeting inside your field so consistently that the distortion became something you started accepting as your own state. This is where the first revelation deepens. What you have been calling exhaustion over these last weeks or months is not a simple depletion. Exhaustion from ordinary life has a texture. It follows effort. It responds to rest. It arrives after exertion and lifts after recovery. It has edges you can locate, a before and an after, a cause you can point to even when you cannot immediately fix it. What a compromised field produces is different in kind, not just in degree. It is a tiredness that does not resolve after sleep, a heaviness that settles in before the day begins, before any demand has been placed on you, before the world has asked anything of you at all, a sense of pressure that arrives without a clear external cause, and then lingers even when the circumstance that seemed to trigger it has long since passed. You wake carrying it. You carry it through ordinary hours. You set it down briefly, and then find it waiting. That persistence, that weight that follows you through environments and moods and circumstances without lifting, is not yours. If that description lands with more precision than you expected, it is because you are not reading a general description. You are reading a field signature. The Sentinels identified this pattern in your configuration, and it is one of the clearest markers of what happens when a frequency hijack vector has been active against a field for an extended period without being sealed. The important word there is extended. This did not begin today. It did not begin last week. Frequency compromise of this kind does not announce itself at the moment it starts. It enters through patterns that the mind classifies as ordinary life, a streak of disrupted sleep that you explained away as stress, a series of small decisions that felt harder than they should have been, as if you were wading through something invisible every time you tried to move forward. Moments of clarity that kept getting interrupted by a kind of internal static you could not locate. Repeated encounters with people or situations that seemed to drain something out of you that never fully replenished, leaving you slightly less than you were before each contact, without a clear reason you could name. These are not random events. These are the early stage markers of an active compromise vector working against your field's coherence. And because each individual instance seems explainable on its own, the pattern stays hidden. That is by design. A hijack vector that makes itself obvious does not survive long enough to do sustained damage. What makes these patterns so effective is precisely their ability to disguise themselves as ordinary life friction, as the texture of being human in a difficult world, as nothing more than a phase you need to push through. What you are feeling right now is not ordinary tension. It is the moment your system stops dismissing what has already begun. If this transmission is putting language around a pressure you have been carrying without explanation, the Arcturian interference log, 7 signs your frequency is compromised, was created for this exact stage. It is not another warning for the sake of fear. It is a direct guide for identifying whether the signs around you point to interference, escalation, compromised frequency, or a threshold you can no longer afford to misread. The link is in the first pinned comment, but it will not remain there forever. This is the first pattern the Sentinels flagged in your configuration. Not the most severe, but the most foundational, because until you can see how the disguise functions, every other recognition remains incomplete. A field that cannot see what is pressing against it cannot protect what it has been given. What has been pressing against your field has been doing so in the language of ordinary difficulty. Stress, coincidence, bad timing, a rough period, a phase that will pass if you just hold on a little longer. These are the labels your conscious mind reaches for when it does not have a more precise interpretive framework, and they are not wrong in themselves. The problem is that they are too broad to be useful at the diagnostic level. They absorb and neutralize the signal before you can read it. And each time you applied one of those labels to what was actually a readable interference pattern, the vector was given another window to operate undisturbed. Not because you were careless, because you were never given the tools to read what was happening beneath the surface of what looked like ordinary difficulty. The Sentinels read this not as failure on your part, but as the predictable result of a field that was never given the correct diagnostic language for what it was actually experiencing. The second pattern is more specific, and it targets something that most people in active compromise states never think to examine. It targets the quality of your certainty, not your emotions, not your decisions, not your mood or your energy or your sense of connection. Your certainty itself, the stable ground beneath your knowing. The way a compromised field begins to distort certainty is subtle but measurable once you have the framework to read it. You start to second-guess things you were previously clear about. Not dramatically, not in a way that announces itself as doubt or crisis. It manifests as a kind of persistent low-level reconsideration, a sense that decisions you already made are somehow still open, that conclusions you already reached are still provisional, that directions you already set are somehow not quite final, not quite locked in, still available to be revised even when nothing has actually changed in your circumstances. This creates an internal environment where the field is constantly revisiting ground it has already covered, burning energy on loops that lead back to the same starting point rather than advancing. A field that cannot hold its forward orientation is a field that is easier to pull backward, and a vector designed to return you to a prior compromised configuration depends entirely on your field's inability to hold what it has already resolved. The Sentinels identified this erosion of certainty as a specific signature of what had been working against your perimeter. The seal addressed the source of that erosion, but you need to recognize the pattern so you can identify going forward when something is genuinely calling for reconsideration, and when you are being pulled backward by a distortion that has no legitimate claim on your field. The third pattern concerns your environment in ways that extend beyond the people in it, though people are part of it. A frequency hijack vector does not only press against your internal state, it works on the texture of your external field as well, on the felt quality of the spaces you move through and the interactions you are embedded in. This is why certain environments that should feel neutral have started feeling inexplicably charged, why certain spaces that once held a sense of stability, rooms you knew, places you returned to, relationships you thought you understood, have begun to feel subtly wrong without a clear reason. Why there are moments when the physical atmosphere around you seems heavier than the room warrants, as if something is pressing in from the perimeter rather than arising from within. This is not imagination. This is field pressure made spatially perceptible. The body registers what the conscious mind has not yet processed. It registers it as unease in spaces that should be safe, as a reluctance to enter or remain that you override with logic, as a somatic resistance that you explain away as tiredness or irrationality. The Sentinels recognize environmental pressure signatures as one of the earliest readable indicators of external interference, precisely because the body is the most sensitive field, instrument available. and it reads perturbations at the perimeter level before the mind has language for them. If your body has been signaling discomfort in environments or interactions that your mind keeps overriding with rational explanation, you have been experiencing exactly this pattern. The body was reading the field correctly. The override was the distortion. The fourth pattern is the one that most viewers in active compromise states find most destabilizing to recognize, because it involves not what feels wrong, but what feels deceptively calm. A frequency hijack vector does not operate only through disturbance. A pressure system that only generates disruption is a pressure system that eventually becomes visible and gets addressed. The more sophisticated mechanism is the opposite. It is the withdrawal of pressure at the precise moment the pressure was becoming noticeable enough to demand attention. The surface calms, the disruptions pause. Something that was becoming urgent seems to resolve itself, or at minimum, seems to stop pressing so hard. And because the relief is real, the mind accepts it as evidence that the problem has passed, that the field has stabilized, that whatever was building has released. The relief feels earned. It feels like a natural exhale after sustained tension. But what the Sentinels understand about false calm is that it is not resolution. It is a pressure inversion. The vector does not disappear during these windows. It relocates. It withdraws from the surface of the field and moves inward, settling at a deeper level of the perimeter, below the threshold where the conscious mind was starting to register it. And when the apparent calm ends, which it always does, the pressure returns from a position further inside than it held before. This is why certain patterns in your life feel like they keep returning at a lower register, closer to the core, less distinguishable from how you actually feel on a day-to-day basis. The false calm windows were not relief. They were the mechanism by which the interference migrated inward, cycle by cycle, each wave of surface quiet purchasing another layer of depth inside the field, until the distortion was no longer something you experienced as external pressure pressing in. It was something you began to experience as your own inner state. The fifth pattern identifies the moment when the compromise becomes genuinely critical, not dangerous in a theatrical sense, but dangerous in the precise sense that matters to Arcturian field diagnosis. The threshold is crossed when the field can no longer reliably distinguish between what originates within it and what has been introduced by the interference. When the distortion has been present long enough, and especially when the false calm cycles have pushed it progressively inward through successive waves of surface withdrawal, it begins to read as internal, as personal, as something native to who you are. Your own thoughts, your own emotional responses, your own conclusions about yourself, about others, about what is possible and what has already been lost. And this is the most sophisticated aspect of a sustained frequency hijack vector, because a distortion that you have claimed as your own will never be examined the way you would examine something you recognized as external. You protect it unconsciously. You defend the conclusions it generates. You feel an instinctive resistance when something attempts to name it as interference, because naming it as interference feels like a challenge to your own perception, your own reality, your own coherence as a person. The Sentinels identified this stage as the one that required the most precise calibration of the seal. Because a field that has reached this threshold is not simply compromised at the perimeter level. It is a field in which the compromise has achieved a degree of integration that makes the vector nearly indistinguishable from the host signal. The interference has learned to speak in your frequency. That is what was sealed tonight. Not a surface disruption, a deeply integrated pattern that had crossed the threshold into signal mimicry. The sixth pattern is the one that many viewers will recognize immediately, but will have previously filed under a completely different category. It concerns the repeated appearance of escalation right before movement, not random disruption, targeted disruption. Pressure that arrives specifically at the moments when your field is preparing to shift, decide, act, or advance into something that would materially alter your trajectory. This is the engine behind what feels like everything going wrong at once, whenever something important is about to change. The interruptions seem to cluster. The friction multiplies. What should be a straightforward forward movement becomes a landscape of complications arriving in rapid sequence, each one plausible on its own, but together forming a wall that stands specifically at the threshold of the thing you are about to do. And the most insidious aspect of this pattern is that it is most intense precisely when the movement being disrupted carries the most weight for your field's forward trajectory. A vector designed to hold you in a compromised configuration cannot afford to let you complete the movements that would permanently alter your frequency baseline. The completion of those movements represents the end of the configuration the interference has built. So the escalation is not random. It is protective from the vector's perspective. It is the interference defending what it has established by making forward movement feel costly enough that you stop, reassess, and return to the place you were trying to leave. The Sentinels do not read this as coincidence. They read it as a targeting signature. The clustering of disruption around activation and movement is one of the clearest diagnostic indicators that a field is under active, intentional external pressure. And if you can look back across your recent experience and recognize this shape, what you are seeing is not a streak of bad luck. You are seeing an interference pattern defending its position. The seal closed the vector that was executing this targeting. But recognizing the pattern means you will not rebuild it through habit, through the unconscious repetition of the assumptions you carried about why things always seem to collapse right at the edge of forward movement. What needs to be said now, before this transmission moves toward its final revelation, is something the Arcturians understand about why seals are authorized at particular moments, rather than earlier ones. Because that question is worth answering directly. If the warning signs were present earlier, and they were, why was the seal not executed sooner? The answer requires understanding what the Arcturian Sentinel protocol is designed to do, and what it is not designed to do. The Sentinels do not intervene at the first appearance of compromised signatures. A field that encounters friction, distortion, or interference in early stages retains the capacity to recognize and self-correct. The protocol allows that process to unfold. The intervention threshold is not triggered by the presence of pressure. It is triggered by the convergence of conditions in which the very capacity needed for self-correction has been compromised by the interference itself. In other words, the seal is authorized at the precise moment when waiting any longer would not produce recognition. It would produce deeper integration. When the mechanism the field would use to identify and address the distortion has been sufficiently affected, That continued delay no longer serves recovery. It serves entrenchment. That threshold is what the Sentinels identified in your field tonight. The seal was not a reward for suffering long enough. It was a precise response to a critical convergence in a process that had been building across a timeline longer than you have been willing to fully name. This is the ultimate revelation that this transmission was built to deliver. You are not imagining the pressure. You are not overreacting to patterns that carry no meaning. You are not in a rough period that patience alone will resolve. What has been documented by the Arcturian Sentinels in your field configuration is a graduated, structured pattern of interference. Entry through disguised friction, erosion of certainty, environmental field pressure, false calm cycling that drives distortion progressively inward, signal mimicry at the integration threshold, and targeted escalation at every point of meaningful forward movement. These 6 patterns do not occur independently. They are stages in a recognizable progression, a warning phase with structure, with sequence, with identifiable thresholds. A phase that was already active before you had language for any part of it. A phase you were living through while calling it something else entirely. And the seal that was executed tonight was the Arcturian confirmation that the phase had crossed beyond the point where further warning was the appropriate response. The appropriate response was closure. Permanent closure of the vector that was executing the pattern, sealing the configuration it had built, and returning the field to a state in which recognition is again possible. What you carry forward from this moment is not fear. Fear is what the interference wanted you to carry, because a field running on fear is a field that has surrendered its forward orientation. It scans for threat instead of holding frequency. It contracts instead of advancing. It becomes exactly what a returning vector needs it to be. What you carry forward is recognition. The specific, structured, diagnostic recognition that this transmission was built to deliver. The kind that changes how you read the pressure against your life before it reaches threshold. The kind that makes the pattern legible at the early stage, in the ordinary friction, in the false calm, in the certainty erosion, before the escalation, not only after the rupture has already occurred. Say this if it is true. I no longer call the pattern coincidence. Before you scroll, leave one sign in the comments that this warning phase has already touched your life. It could be repeated pressure, strange coincidence, energetic heaviness, unexplained disruption, or the feeling that something is escalating beneath the surface. Name it clearly. If this transmission recognized something you have been carrying in silence, share it with someone who keeps dismissing the signs around them. And if you are ready to recognize the warning before it escalates, subscribe to Arcturian Starseed warning. You are not watching this by accident. You are recognizing a warning already in motion. And this is only the beginning.